going to talk about power, autonomy, student-centered learning as it arises in a corpus of published English lesson plans. So before I get into that, I'm going to set the context for the research that I do. It's all based in critical discourse analysis, which is an approach to investigating language that analyzes discourse, large chunks of text, like not just individual words or sentences, but not usually whole text or even large collections of text. And it does that critically, within the sense of criticism, looking at how discourse is complicit in and reflective of systems of inequality. This can be issues of racism or gender or power issues. And so in my case, looking at how that sort of thing plays out in the discourse of teachers. Now, CDA relies upon a postmodern perspective on language use, which is to say that there's a relationship between the aspects of social practice, which is what a social community does, both verbally and also physically speaking. But verbally in terms of the texts that they create and consume. This will be governed by rules of discourse, that is, rules about who is allowed to make texts, what texts are authoritative, how those texts have to be shaped, like what is their style, like how we know that there's differences between, say, the research article genre and then the newspaper genre, and this community of practice that creates these, not directly, not explicitly, but indirectly creates these kinds of discursive rules. Now, these rules are not, these domains are not independent, or I should say they're separable, but they're different but not separable. They're dialectically related. Now, the particular aspect of discourse I'm interested in is teacher discourse, specifically that which occurs between teachers. So some CD work has been done like in the classroom, like how teachers and students talk together. But I'm interested in how we talk to each other, because I think that how we talk to each other shapes what happens in the classroom as well. So the particular text that I investigated come from The Language Teacher, which is a journal published by the Japan Association for Language Teaching, which is one of the larger professional organizations of language, specifically English teachers here in Japan. In this journal, there's a section called My Share. Now, while the journal has research articles, and the journal has more practical things that kind of work for the organization, My Share are in an interesting boundary where they're somewhat casual and somewhat professional, because each article describes one lesson activity or one lesson plan. And the idea is a teacher says, okay, here's something that I did in my class that was effective in some way. Here is why it was effective, and here is why you might want to do it, and then the actual practical steps for how you would go about doing that. And it's that first part, that why it's effective, or what's good about it, that I find really interesting, because that is essentially the authors, or collective author, telling us what is important in language teaching. Right? There's a community of language teachers here in Japan that have perspectives on language teaching, which are somewhat local and somewhat global. And so the question is, what can we learn about those ideas, those identities, from this professional discourse? So my research looked at the 2011 to 2016 time period, because often CDA wants to take a broad approach to get as many texts as possible. So I have 177 articles in this particular corpus, a little bit over 100,000 words that I had analyzed. So now CDA, saying you do CDA doesn't tell you what the researcher's actually done, because it is inherently multi-methodological. Some researchers have a preferred set of steps that they follow that they think are particularly important, but other CDA researchers will adapt over time to a particular body of text or to a particular set of questions. And that was the approach that I took, a very eclectic approach. So I used on the more, I think the aspect ratio is different, that's why this doesn't look like it should. The more quantitative approach uses corpus linguistics. So that's the use of computer software to analyze texts, to kind of make statements about the whole corpus, statistically speaking. I use genre analysis, which is the use of the idea that, again, genres have distinct rules and that those rules exist for the benefit of the community, and attempting to understand how those work. And finally, discourse and text analysis, which is a more qualitative approach that instead digs down deep. So while this often ends up being decontextualized, this lets me go into an individual article and say, what is exactly going on here and what ideologies can we find? So, how's this one doing? Maybe okay. One of the very first things you often do when you do corpus linguistics is frequency counts. Just what words or grammatical structures or whatever are frequent in your text. And that's what I've got here. This is the my share corpus on the left. And we always compare them to reference corpora, so the British National Corpus and the Corpus of Contemporary American English. The question is not what words are frequent, but what words are more or less frequent than are typically used in the English language. And there was, from this very simple search, I found a really surprising result, which is number 5 here, student. And what's strange about that is that if you notice, this is literally the only content word on the entire screen, meaning a word with actual semantic meaning. Every other word here is what's called a function word, or grammatical word, so prepositions, pronouns, auxiliary verbs. Words that don't have a meaning independent of their context and rather exist because of English's grammar rules. In fact, in the B&C and the COCA, you have to go down to rank 79 in the B&C and 54 in the COCA to find your first content word. English is dominated by function words, just statistically speaking. So to have student appear so high tells us that this is the focus of this corpus. And in fact, the second most frequent one is, down here, is teacher. It's almost like the genre exists in a certain sense to bring these agents of students and teachers together into the same textual space. Now I had to go beyond that because there's other ways that these agents are represented in the corpus. There are synonyms like instructor or learner. 90% of the pronouns, more than 90%, referred to either students or teachers, so I had to go through and kind of, they call it a NAFRA resolution, figure out what the pronouns referred to. Most interestingly, though, was the use of passives and imperatives, which I'm going to come back to in a second. But when we add all these together, we find that the word student is the 5th most frequent word, student is the most frequent semantic unit, and teacher is the 2nd most frequent semantic unit. And the reason why teacher jumps so much here has to do with the passives and imperatives. The majority of time, the teachers as agents are in the texts, they were hidden. They were semantically present but lexically elided. So, as an example here, passive sentence, the sentence that says the students are given grades. Well, that underlying semantics of that sentence is the teacher gives the students grades, but of course when we write the passive, we drop out the agent. Through careful analysis of the passives that appeared, what it turned out was the use of passive voice in this genre tended to hide students' lack of agency. In other words, on the surface reading, it appeared that students had agency, that students were making choices. But when we look at what's actually going on in the classroom, students were not the ones making the choices, teachers were. Imperatives, on the other hand, kind of did the opposite. Here we have a sentence like how the students get into groups. Again, the underlying semantics there is the teacher has the students get into groups. What these tended to do was to naturalize teacher power. They made it appear not just kind of common or acceptable, but just like, of course, teachers have, should have, always will have all of the power in the classroom. And of course, it doesn't have to be that way. There are plenty of pedagogies that allow students to have more input, whether we call that critical pedagogy, or student-centered pedagogy, or independent or active learning. That's not what's in this corpus. And this is a good time to mention that CDA isn't about figuring out what individual authors think. And in fact, I know that this particular use of verb structure that leads to an ideological result was actually required by the instructions. The instructions that are given to authors is that the procedure and preparation sections are supposed to be written in imperative tense. And the editors when I talked to the editors, they gave me some reasons for that, like partially it's just shorter, it saves space, but the end result is we have a genre that replicates a very large power differential between students and teachers. So it doesn't matter that that was the intention of any one individual or not. A reader who's going to be looking through these, looking for things to use in their classrooms, their end result is going to be like, oh, okay, I guess teachers in control, I guess that's normal. I guess that's what we do here in Japan, right? So, kind of even at this very base grammatical lexical level, we have a kind of problematic relationship between teachers and students. And that was continued on when I looked at verb-agent co-occurrence. That is, what verbs go with what teachers, which is a kind of short way of looking at what students do in the classroom and what teachers do in the classroom. So kind of arbitrarily, I just drew a cutoff at the top 0.1% of the co-occurring verbs. And what I found was that while many of the verbs were shared by both, there were a set of verbs that only co-occurred with teachers frequently and only co-occurred with teachers and students. And there was a semantic difference between these categories. The ones in the middle tended to be pretty generic. Words like say or do or think, words like make and use that have a lot of meanings in English tended to be shared. But in addition to those kind of words, teachers also got verbs of leadership and judgment. So for example, they didn't just say things, but they would emphasize something. They would say something and at the same time they'd be making a judgment about what's important in it. They get verbs like assess and grade. They get verbs like call, where it's not just, again, speaking, it's I'm speaking and I am deciding who will be the next speaker in the classroom. Students get almost no access to verbs like that. But what they get that teachers don't are verbs of learning, verbs of change, and verbs of feeling, like verbs of emotion. So learn, respond, participate, and verbs like worry or feel. So students have a more kind of complete identity in the fact that they're people who change and overgo learning. Teachers are a lot more robotic in this corpus. They have a lot less, while they have more judgment, they have a lot less humanity. And at the same time, students don't get to exercise. Again, it's another way of saying they don't get the agency. This is not a case where students are taking on leadership roles, where they're centered in learning, where they get autonomous learning. It's not a case where the teacher is a co-learner, as we often see in student-centered teaching. Now, I also looked at this from a higher level perspective. Move analysis is an aspect of genre analysis where you kind of break a text into rhetorical chunks, where each chunk has a function. Like this chunk describes a benefit of the lesson, and then this chunk describes background information, and this describes how to actually do the lesson. When we look at the moves for just the introduction and conclusion part, which is where more of the interesting information is, I broke those into categories, and we see that the third most common type of benefit was something related to active learning, autonomy, promotion, or student-centered learning. So it looks like this is a somewhat important aspect of this corpus, although not nearly as important as the top two, which was engendering good feelings in students and benefits that make life easier for the teacher. But when we again dig down a little bit more into some of the details, we start to see a problem. If we actually care about promoting autonomy and student-centered learning. So, first of all, the topmost one is motivation, and motivation tended to be motivating students to do the task at hand, not motivating them to become language learners or to learn on their own. When we look at ones like autonomy encouraging, we start to see the big contrast. We see an activity that says, okay, this activity promotes autonomous learning. But to take one example, the author said, okay, students do a lot of research and they make presentations on famous people. So they're really getting a chance to go out there and make their own decisions and make these presentations. The problem is that the actual activity, the teacher said, the very strict time limits had to be exactly 3 minutes. The author listed like 6 distinct points that every presentation had to include. And the students were not just limited to researching a famous person. They would do the same activity over every 2 weeks. And like the first week it was research an athlete, and then research a politician. And then it started getting these really narrow categories, like research a scientist, research a philosopher. I mean, how many philosophers do students know? And if they don't, they're just going to go on Wikipedia and find a philosopher, and they're going to download the information and make a presentation. That's not autonomy. When you give all of these strong restrictions on what students are doing, just because students are doing work on their own outside of the classroom, that does not mean we're promoting autonomy. Similarly, for student-centered, or other phrases related to student-centered, the authors often seem to use it as a synonym for students talk to each other. Right? That it wasn't really a case where either student needs were taken into account, or it was focused on language the students might specifically need that was distinct from what other students might need, or focused on students' lives. It didn't have any of those characteristics at all. Rather, it was the same kind of activities you would find in more traditional language learning, like have students describe things to one another, describe pictures to one another, which I'm not saying that that's not useful, but I am saying it's not student-centered, because it's not doing what student-centered language teaching is supposed to do. Now, I can't say for certain why we have this mismatch between the terms and the benefits the authors were giving and what was actually going on in the lesson. One possibility is the authors don't know what these terms mean in a specific TESOL context. Not everyone who teaches language in Japan and is a member of JALT is a teacher by choice. It's kind of something that people fall into in many cases here. Or maybe they plan to be here for a year and then they end up being here for 10. Or it could be almost a more sinister aspect in that they may be like, oh, here's the buzzword of this year, so I'm going to make, my activity is autonomy encouraging. What can I do that kind of matches that? That'll get my article published. So, in summary, a little bit faster than I thought, I would say, or I said in the research, that this corpus is very much student-focused. Again, the number 5 most common word in the corpus, and even more than that with the other representations. The corpus is not student-centered in any way, or very rarely. And in fact, it is the rare exceptions that kind of point out that it is possible to do student-centered teaching in the context here in Japan, because some of the teachers were doing it, a small minority of them. But the fact that most of them were not means that's not where we're at with kind of current, highly successful language learning. Putting that another way, in a almost more linguistic way, we could say that true student-centered teaching or autonomy-promoting teaching would be one where students are learning a language. Students are the subjects of the language learning. But instead, what we see in this corpus is students basically are the objects of teachers' teaching or teachers' education. Now, of course, that can still lead to language learning, successful language learning outcomes. But if, like me, you want a more student-centered classroom, or like some schools promote, or for that matter, the Japanese government has been promoting student-centered learning at the junior high school and high school level since around the 90s, and at the university level since 2012. If that's what you want, then you need to recognize that's not where we are right now. Despite the fact that we might see a lot of research publications on that, that's not where kind of the practical day-to-day behavior of teachers is, if we can take this corpus as representative of at least a significant enough number of teachers. So that brings me to the end there. I think I finished a little earlier. Do you have any questions?
You mentioned the use of buzzwords by teachers. I'm wondering if you analyze that at all to see if there's a much greater preponderance of buzzwords compared to... other textual sources, and whether they change over time to match the dominant.
I think that's the thing that what needs to be done is I need since I looked at 6 years, which is kind of a significant amount, but it's not enough to make a good historical comparison. I think that would be the thing to check. One thing, for example, I did look at is, I looked at changes in use of technology over time. There were definitely trends there, where there was a period where CLT spikes, CLT, yes, where computer-assisted language learning, call activities, spikes in the middle of that corpus but drops out, and mobile language learning increases. So I could see some trends there. So what I would need to do is to track, I'd probably want to go for a 10 to 20 year period and see if there's a change over time. Unfortunately, this corpus was possible because the data is online, and it only goes back, as we start going before 2011, it gets a lot more sporadic as to what the data is. So I might have to switch to a different data set to find that.
You mentioned that you spoke to the editors of the journal too. I wonder, did you bring up or did you talk to them about, or do you have any sense of whether the editor's understanding of student autonomy and that sort of thing might be shaping these trends?
Actually, as a matter of fact, I know that it doesn't. This is one of the key findings that kind of, one of the things a lot of textual analysts do is they don't go and talk to the producers. I found out that basically the goal of the editors was to publish as many as they possibly could, because they see it as a service to the members of helping them get published, which even though it's not peer-reviewed in Japan, that can be helpful to have non-peer-reviewed publications. I think that that does a disservice to the other members, but they said that they never rejected an article because it was beneficial or not beneficial. They never rejected it because it was too similar to another activity. It was all, the only rejections they ever made was it was 3 times too long, or it was a research article, not really a practical activity. So I know that this is capturing more of the kind of zeitgeist, so to speak, the general atmosphere of language teaching, at least among these members, than it is the individual editors. And I actually advocate that that should change. We should have more editorial control.
This may be a little bit of a sidetrack question, but what do you see as the biggest hurdle to implementing student-centered learning and language teaching?
Well, I think that it would be that language teachers, I think, don't really like student-centered teaching. I think if this corpus, if these findings are believable, I don't think that that's what language teachers, at least in this particular community, are interested in doing. Because it's, to be honest, hard. It's hard to do student-centered learning, and it's hard to do autonomy promotion, because it involves a lot of work outside of the classroom and the things you're talking about, self-access centers and things like that, which teachers may or may not get credit for doing. And adjacent to that is the fact that a lot of teachers in Japan anyways believe students don't want student-centered learning. They want a teacher-directed teacher lecture. And even though there's been some kind of conflicting findings as to what students want, especially because there seems to be, when you ask students what they want, they often say they want a lecture-based class, but when they're actually put into those classes, the more student-centered approaches, they often rate them a little bit higher. So it's that teachers perceive students as wanting a lecture, and so they deliver a lecture, or they deliver a fun activity. Like a lot of the things in this particular corpus are about, let's have fun, let's play games, and that sort of thing, which tends not to be a student-centered lesson. And so they try and do what gets them the most positive response at the moment, and or maybe on their evaluations at the end of the semester, not necessarily what's good for longer-term language learning. All right.
Okay, well, thank you so much.